You ever see a lawman stand in a muddy yard and trade his wrists for a woman's front door, irons biting deep while company men grin over her kids like they already tagged and waiting to be loaded with the freight? When the next frontier yarn rolls out on Dusty Trail Stories, listen close, leave your mark in the comments, and swear yourself to that subscribe. The axe head was a 5-pound wedge of cold iron, and it bit into the frozen heart of the ponderosa pine with a dull, rhythmic thud that died instantly in the thin air of the Wyoming Territory. It was late afternoon in November of 1890, a day so still that the silence felt heavy enough to weigh a man down. Elias Thorne swung the handle with the practiced, mindless repetition of a man who had spent 3 years trying to chop away his own memories, breath pluming in white clouds that froze in his beard. Around him, the high country was a cathedral of ice and timber, indifferent to his penance. Inside the small cabin behind him, a pot of coffee was boiling on the cast-iron stove, the smell of burnt beans and chicory seeping through the cracks in the logs, promising a bitter warmth that was the only company Elias allowed himself since the fever had taken his wife and son. He paused for a moment, resting the axe head in the snow, wiping sweat from his brow with a rough leather glove despite the temperature hovering at 10 degrees below freezing. This was the peace he had bought with isolation, a quiet so profound that he could hear the blood rushing in his own ears. He reached for the wood he had just split, his mind drifting to the simple, comforting anticipation of sitting by the fire while the sun dipped behind the peaks. And then the world shattered. It was not the wind, nor the groan of a settling tree, but the dry, flat crack of a Winchester rifle echoing from the valley below. Elias stood frozen, his hand gripping the axe handle until his knuckles turned white beneath the leather. It was not a hunter's shot, a hunter fired once and waited. This was followed by the frantic racking of a lever and a second shot, sharp and demanding. Then came the sound that turned Elias's blood to ice water, a woman's scream, high and thin, tearing through the pristine silence like a jagged blade. The coffee on the stove would boil over and turn to black tar on the iron, hissing into nothingness. The peace was gone, bleeding out into the snow with every second he stood still. Elias dropped the axe. It fell forgotten into the drift as he turned and moved toward the cabin, shedding the lethargy of the hermit with a terrifying suddenness. He grabbed his heavy coat from the peg and the repeater rifle hanging by the door, the weight of the weapon settling into his hands like a long-lost limb. He did not run, running wasted breath and clouded judgment. Instead, he moved through the timber with the long, devouring stride of the federal marshal he used to be, a ghost moving through the trees he knew better than the lines on his own palms. The screaming had stopped, replaced by the low, angry murmur of men's voices carried on the wind. Elias circled wide, using the tree line for cover, his boots making no sound on the fresh powder. Through the gaps in the pines, the Vance homestead came into view. It was a pitiful sight, a cabin with walls rotting and a roof that sagged under the weight of the winter, smoke limping from a chimney that looked ready to collapse. But the danger was clear and present. 3 horses, too fine and well fed for this hard country, were stamping in the snow. 3 men stood in a semicircle around the door, their postures relaxed with the arrogance of predators who knew their prey was cornered. And there, in the doorway, stood Clara Vance. She looked small against the encroaching dark, wearing a dress patched a dozen times, her hair escaping its pins. But in her hands, shaking violently, she held a double-barreled shotgun, leveling it at the intruders. Behind her skirts, 2 pairs of terrified eyes peered out from the gloom. Elias jacked around into the chamber of his rifle, the mechanical clack loud enough to announce Judgment Day, and stepped out from the trees. The domestic silence of his afternoon was dead, buried under the snow, and only the cold, hard logic of violence remained. The confrontation did not end in gunfire, though the air was so tight with violence it felt as if a single spark from a pipe would have set the whole valley ablaze. Elias Thorne did not raise his voice, he simply raised the barrel of his Winchester until it was leveled at the chest of the rider in the center, a man with a coat that cost more than the cabin behind him. The intruders, hired muscle with eyes like dead fish, measured the distance and the steadiness of Elias's hands against their own desire to live another day. They spat on the snow, muttered curses that were lost to the rising wind, and turned their mounts, riding off with a promise of return that hung heavy and poisonous in the frozen air. Elias watched them go until they were nothing but dark smudges against the white tree-line, then turned to the cabin. It was a tomb in the making. The wind screamed through gaps in the chinking large enough to put a fist through, and the stove was cold iron. He did not ask permission, nor did he offer comfort in words. He simply told Clara Vance to pack what could be carried in 5 minutes. The ride back to his ranch was a brutal, lung-searing traverse through a world that had turned hostile. The wind had picked up, driving snow horizontally like needles, and by the time they reached the solid, squared timbers of Elias's homestead, Clara was swaying in the saddle, her lips blue and her eyes rolling back from hypothermia. Inside, the cabin was a fortress against the white hell outside. Elias kicked the door shut against the gale and carried the children to the rug before the hearth, stoking the embers into a roaring blaze that cracked and popped with pitch. But it was Clara who worried him. She stood by the table, shivering so violently that her teeth chattered with a sound like dry bones rattling in a cup. She was in the grip of the cold sickness, where the blood retreats to the core and the mind starts to drift into a warm, deadly sleep. Elias moved with the rough efficiency of a man who had treated livestock and wounded deputies alike. He stripped the wet, freezing coat from her shoulders, the heavy wool falling to the floor with a wet slap. Her dress underneath was damp from the snow that had driven through the gaps in her old coat, clinging to her frame like a second skin. "You need heat," he rasped, his voice rusty from disuse. He guided her to the chair by the fire, but the shivering did not stop. It racked her small body, a convulsion of muscles trying desperately to generate warmth. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. They were like ice, pale and lifeless. He began to rub them, friction generating a slow heat, his rough, calloused palms rasping against her skin. The firelight danced across the walls, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to close the world down to just the two of them. The children were asleep, exhausted by terror and the sudden warmth, huddled under a buffalo robe in the corner. Elias moved his hands up to her wrists, chafing the skin, then to her arms. She looked down at him, her eyes wide and dark, the pupils blown out by adrenaline and the thawing rush of blood. The necessary intimacy of survival began to shift, the air in the cabin growing heavy and charged. Elias felt the pulse in her wrist flutter like a trapped bird against his thumb. He looked up, locking eyes with her, and for a moment, the wind outside ceased to exist. There was only the heat of the fire, the smell of wet wool and wood smoke, and the sudden, terrifying realization of a woman's scent filling a space that had known only solitude and grief for 3 years. He reached up to brush a damp lock of hair from her forehead, his fingers lingering on the curve of her cheek, which was flushing pink as the blood returned. The touch was electric, a jolt that went straight to his gut. Clara leaned into his hand, an unconscious seeking of contact, her breath hitching in her throat. It was a dangerous moment, a precipice as steep as any canyon wall in the territory. Her lips parted, a silent question or perhaps a plea, and Elias felt his own resolve crumbling like sandstone under rain. He leaned in, the distance between them shrinking to nothing, the raw, magnetic pull of two broken people finding a jagged edge that fit together. His hand moved to the nape of her neck, his thumb tracing the sensitive skin there, and he saw her eyelids flutter shut. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken hunger, the kind of desperate need that comes when death has brushed past too closely. Then, the world intruded. A fist pounded against the heavy oak of the door, 3 sharp, authoritative blows that shattered the spell like a hammer on glass. Elias pulled back as if burned, his hand dropping to the Colt on his hip in a blur of motion. Clara gasped, the flush on her cheeks draining back to pale fear. "Open up, Thorne." The voice was muffled by the timber but unmistakable, James Wallace, the banker's son, a man who wore his father's money like a badge of office. Elias moved to the door, cracking it open but leaving the heavy iron chain engaged. Outside, in the swirling snow, Wallace sat on a high-stepping bay horse, flanked by 2 men holding torches that hissed in the falling snow. "You are harboring trespassers," Wallace shouted over the wind, his face twisted in a sneer of entitlement. "Clara Vance has defaulted on her loan. The property is forfeit." Elias stared at him, his eyes cold and flat. "She is my guest," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "And this is my land. You are not welcome on it." Wallace laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "You have 48 hours, Thorn. 48 hours to clear them out. After that, we burn it down. The railroad is coming through this valley, and we will not let a washed-up marshal and a penniless widow stand in the way of progress." Wallace wheeled his horse and rode into the dark, leaving the threat hanging in the doorway. Elias closed the heavy door and threw the bolt, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. He turned back to Clara, but the moment of intimacy was gone, replaced by the cold, hard knowledge of a war that had just been declared. Elias Thorne rode out under a moon that looked like a sliver of bone sharpened against the black whetstone of the sky. He left the cabin with the grim finality of a man closing a coffin lid, telling Clara to bar the door and shoot anything that did not speak with his voice. The ride to the settlement was a 5-mile descent into a frozen purgatory, the wind having died down to a whisper that was somehow worse than the gale, for it allowed the cold to settle into the hollows of the land like invisible water. The town, a collection of clapboard shanties and false-fronted ambitions huddled against the base of the canyon, was dark save for the yellow, sickly glow of the saloon and the lantern burning on the porch of the land surveyor's office. Elias tied his horse in the shadows of the livery, moving with the stiffness of the cold but the silence of a predator. He was not here to negotiate, the time for words had died with the sunset. He was here for leverage. The surveyor's office was the brain of the beast, the place where James Wallace and his father turned blood into ink and ink into deeds. Elias bypassed the front door, slipping into the alley where the snow was piled waist-high and smelled of refuse and coal ash. He found the back window, the sash frozen shut, and used the blade of his hunting knife to work the latch, the sound of wood splintering masked by the distant, tinny piano music drifting from the saloon. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of dry paper, dust, and the lingering, acrid scent of expensive cigars. Elias struck a lucifer match, the sudden flare illuminating a room cluttered with maps that sliced the open range into neat, profitable squares. He moved to the heavy oak desk that dominated the room, the wood polished by the elbows of men who stole land with a pen stroke. The drawers were locked, but Elias did not have the patience for finesse. He wedged his knife into the gap and leaned his weight into it, the wood groaning before the lock mechanism snapped with a metallic pop. He pulled the drawer open and began to rifle through the papers, his eyes scanning for the name Vance. He found it in a black leather ledger at the bottom of the stack, a book heavy with the sins of the territory. He opened it, tracing the lines with a gloved finger until he found the entry. It was not listed under debts or mortgages. It was listed under acquisitions. Beside the name Thomas Vance, there was no figure for a loan repayment. There was only a red cross and a payout listed to a man named Silas Grimaldi, a known bushwhacker who would kill his own mother for a bottle of whiskey. It was a hit list, plain as day. Thomas Vance had not died in a cave-in, he had been purchased and erased. Elias shoved the ledger inside his coat, against his chest, but as he turned to leave, the floorboard behind him creaked. It was not the settling of the building. He spun around, the motion instinctive, but the shadow in the corner was faster. A blade flashed in the darkness, a wicked curve of steel seeking his throat. Elias threw his arm up, deflecting the killing blow, but the knife skittered down and sliced a long, jagged line across his ribs, tearing through coat, shirt, and skin. The pain was a white-hot line of fire, but Elias did not cry out. He slammed his forehead into the attacker's nose, feeling the cartilage give way, then brought the heavy brass butt of his revolver down onto the man's temple with a sickening thud. The man crumbled like a sack of grain. Elias did not wait to check if he was dead. He scrambled out the window, the ledger pressing against his wound, his breath coming in ragged gasps that tasted of copper. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of agony, the cold seeping into the cut and making his whole side throb with a dull, nauseating rhythm. He kept his hand pressed to his side, feeling the warm, sticky wetness soaking his glove, a stark contrast to the freezing night. When he stumbled through the door of his cabin, the sudden heat hit him like a physical blow. Clara was there in an instant, the shotgun lowered, her eyes widening as she saw the dark stain spreading across his midsection. She did not scream, the nurse in her took command before the woman could panic. "Table," she ordered, her voice tight. "Get to the table." Elias slumped onto the rough wood, his vision swimming. He watched through half-lidded eyes as she moved, boiling water, tearing strips of linen, her hands steady despite the fear he could smell on her. She cut away his coat and shirt, peeling the fabric from the wound. The air in the cabin hissed as she cleaned the blood away, the raw exposure of his skin to the firelight making him shiver. "It is deep," she whispered, her fingers probing the edges of the gash. "I have to stitch it." Elias nodded, gritting his teeth. "Do it." As she worked, driving the needle through his flesh, the pain was a sharp, grounding anchor, but it was the touch of her hands that threatened to undo him. Her fingers were warm, slick with his blood, moving with a firm, possessive knowledge of his body. She leaned in close, her concentration absolute, and he could feel the heat radiating from her, could smell the scent of her sweat and the soap she had used to wash, a smell of life that cut through the metallic tang of blood. The pain began to recede into a dull roar, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and something darker, heavier. When she tied off the last stitch, she did not pull away. She remained leaning over him, her hands resting flat on his bare chest, right over his heart which was hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. She looked up, and the relief in her eyes shattered into something else, a raw, frantic hunger born of near death and isolation. Elias reached up, his hand trembling, and cupped the back of her neck, pulling her down. It was not a gentle kiss, it was a collision. Her mouth was hot and desperate, tasting of salt and fear. She made a low sound in her throat and climbed onto the table between his legs, heedless of the blood, heedless of the children sleeping 10 feet away in the shadows. Her hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, her body pressing against his wounded side, the pain mixing with the pleasure in a dizzying spiral. Elias groaned, his hands roaming over the rough fabric of her dress, finding the warmth of her skin beneath, needing to anchor himself to her, to prove he was still alive. For a moment, there was no railroad, no ledger, no winter. There was only the friction of skin, the desperate heat of their breath, and the firelight painting their entangled forms in gold and shadow. He pulled her hips flush against him, the friction maddening, bordering on pain, a frantic attempt to erase the cold that had lived in his bones for 3 years. She bit his lip, hard enough to draw blood, a feral claim that matched the violence of the night. But as his hand moved to the bodice of her dress, the heavy weight of the ledger inside his discarded coat fell to the floor with a dull thud. The sound was a gavel bringing them back to the sentence they were under. Clara pulled back, her chest heaving, her lips swollen and red, her eyes wide with the realization of what they had just done, and what they still had to survive. They were not just lovers in the dark, they were conspirators in a war, and the ledger on the floor was the declaration. The ledger lay on the table like a slab of lead, heavy with the names of dead men and the price of their souls, but to Elias Thorne, it looked less like evidence and more like a tombstone carved with their own names. The heat of the moment, the frantic collision of bodies and breath that had seized them in the firelight, had cooled into a hard, crystalline dread as the reality of their position settled into the marrow of his bones. They held the truth in their hands, ink on paper that proved the railroad and the judge were grinding the territory into dust for profit, but truth without a gavel to strike it home was nothing but a whisper in a hurricane. Elias pulled away from Clara, the loss of her warmth striking him harder than the winter draft, and buttoned his torn, blood-stiffened shirt with fingers that felt thick and clumsy. He did not look at her, not because of shame, but because looking at her now, seeing the flush on her skin and the terror warring with resolve in her eyes, made the thought of what had to be done nearly impossible to bear. They could not stay. The ranch, with its squared timbers and roaring hearth, was no longer a sanctuary, it was a trap, a fixed point on a map held by men who could buy arsonists as easily as they bought whiskey. The nearest federal judge who had not been bought by the Union Pacific sat in Fort Bridger, a 3-day ride through the throat of the Devil's Gap, a journey that would test a healthy man on a clear day, let alone a wounded one dragging a widow and 2 children through the teeth of a Wyoming winter. "Pack," Elias rasped, the word tearing at his throat. "Only what keeps you warm or keeps you alive. Everything else belongs to the ghosts now." Clara did not argue, did not weep for the loss of the few possessions she had managed to salvage from her own ruined life. She simply nodded, her jaw set with a flinty determination that reminded Elias of the women who had crossed the plains in covered wagons, burying their dead in shallow graves and keeping their eyes fixed on the western horizon. They moved with the frantic, silent efficiency of fugitives. Elias loaded the saddlebags with jerky, hardtack, and every round of ammunition he possessed, his side throbbing with a dull, sickening rhythm that synced with his heartbeat. He strapped the ledger to his body, wrapping it in oilskin and binding it beneath his coat, against the bandages Clara had stitched, as if the paper itself could stanch the bleeding. The children, roused from their sleep and bundled into layers of wool until they looked like round, confused bears, were silent, sensing the vibrating tension of the adults. They left the ranch an hour before dawn, under a sky the color of a bruised plum, the wind picking up from the north with a low, mournful moan that promised nothing but suffering. Elias did not look back as they rode into the timber. Looking back was for men who had a future to return to, and he was not sure any of them would live to see the sunset, let alone the spring. The first day was a purgatory of gray light and biting cold, the horses trudging through snow that reached their knees, their breath steaming like locomotives in the thin air. They made good time, pushing hard toward the mouth of the gap, but the mountains were indifferent gods, and they were shifting their mood. By noon, the sun was swallowed by a wall of white that descended from the peaks, a curtain of snow so dense it seemed to erase the world. This was not a storm, it was the white hell, the kind of blizzard the old trappers whispered about, the kind that froze cattle standing up and buried men before they even knew they were dead. The temperature plummeted, dropping 10, then 20 degrees in the span of an hour. The wind rose to a scream, a physical force that battered them, driving ice crystals into every exposed inch of skin until their faces felt like they were being sandblasted with glass. Elias took the lead, his head bowed against the gale, trusting his horse to find the footing he could no longer see. The world narrowed down to the few feet in front of his nose, the rhythmic rise and fall of the horse's neck, the white swirl of the void, and the gnawing agony in his side which burned hot against the freezing cold. He kept glancing back, checking on Clara and the children, who were little more than snow-covered shapes huddled on their mounts, tethered to his saddle horn by a length of rope so they would not wander off into the oblivion. By late afternoon, the situation had deteriorated from desperate to fatal. The horses were faltering, their chests heaving, ice forming thick crusts around their nostrils. The snow was waist-deep in the drifts now, and the animals were panicking, their eyes rolling white in the gloom. Then, disaster struck. Elias Gelding stepped into a hidden deadfall, a tangle of logs buried under the powder. The horse screamed, a sound that cut through the wind, and went down hard, throwing Elias into the drift. He landed on his wounded side, the pain blinding him for a second, a jagged bolt of lightning that turned his vision red. He scrambled up, gasping, spitting snow, and moved to the animal, but one look told him the story. The foreleg was snapped clean, the bone protruding. The horse thrashed, unable to rise. Elias felt a hollow pit open in his stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. He drew his revolver, the metal burning his skin even through the glove. He put a hand on the horse's neck, whispering a meaningless apology that was snatched away by the wind, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was swallowed instantly by the storm. He turned to Clara, shouting over the roar of the wind. "We walk. The horses ca not make the grade. We have to find shelter or we die here." Abandoning the horses felt like signing their own death warrants, but staying with them was suicide. They took the buffalo robes and the saddlebags, leaving the saddles and the rest of the gear to be buried. The trudge that followed was a nightmare of exhaustion. Every step was a battle against the snow that tried to drag them down, a physical wrestling match with the earth itself. Elias carried the youngest child, the boy's weight pulling on his stitches until he felt warm wetness seeping into the bandages again, but he clamped his jaw and marched. He could not stop. If he stopped, he would lie down. If he lay down, the seductive warmth of the freeze would take him, and they would all be statues by morning. He drove them forward with curses and pleas, his voice raw, forcing Clara to keep moving when she stumbled, hauling her upright when her knees gave out. They were seeking a spur of rock Elias remembered from a hunting trip a decade ago, a shallow overhang near the canyon wall that offered the only respite from the wind. It felt like hours, or perhaps days, of endless white misery before the dark shape of the rock loomed out of the blindness. It was not a cave, just a depression in the granite where the cliff face buckled inward, but it was out of the wind. They collapsed into the shelter, the sudden absence of the gale's physical beating leaving them reeling and dizzy. Elias moved on autopilot, his mind a distant observer to the actions of his body. He cleared a space in the back of the hollow, spreading one of the buffalo robes on the frozen stone. He made Clara sit, then pulled the children into the center, wrapping them in the second robe until they were a single lump of shivering wool. But the cold here was insidious, a creeping paralysis that seeped from the stone itself. There was no wood for a fire, no way to generate heat save for what their own bodies could produce, and they were all running on empty. Elias checked the children. They were lethargic, their movements slow and clumsy, the first stage of the end. He looked at Clara. Her face was a mask of pale wax, her lips cracked and blue, her eyes struggling to stay focused on his. She was fading. The realization hit him with the force of a blow. The robes were not enough. The layers of clothing were freezing stiff with their own sweat. "We have to bundle," Elias said, his voice a cracked whisper in the small, dark space. "Skin to skin. It is the only way." Clara looked at him, too exhausted for modesty, too terrified for hesitation. She understood the physics of survival as well as he did. Alone coal dies, but coals heaped together hold the fire. They stripped the heavy, frozen outer coats off, then the layers beneath, moving with fumbling, numb fingers in the gloom. It was an act stripped of romance, raw and primal. Elias pulled the children close, tucking them against his chest and stomach, then pulled Clara in. They lay under the heavy pile of buffalo hides, a tangle of limbs and shivering flesh. The shock of the cold air on bare skin was agonizing for a moment before the heat began to pool. Elias lay on his back, the stone stealing heat from his spine, while Clara lay half atop him, her head on his shoulder, the children sandwiched between them. He pulled the edges of the robes tight, sealing them in a cocoon of animal musk and darkness. Slowly, agonizingly, the shivering began to subside. The collective warmth of 4 human beings began to create a microclimate beneath the furs. Elias could feel Clara's heart beating against his side, a frantic rhythm that slowly steadied as the blood began to flow back into her extremities. The pain in his wound was a constant, throbbing companion, a reminder that he was alive, but it was the sensation of her body against his that anchored him to the earth. Her skin was soft where his was rough, warm where he was cold. In the absolute darkness of the storm, with the wind howling like a lost soul just feet away, the intimacy of the previous night returned, but changed. It was no longer the frantic, explosive hunger of 2 people trying to forget death, it was the steady, desperate clinging of 2 people trying to sustain life. "Elias," she whispered, her voice vibrating against his chest. "Are we going to die here?" He hesitated. He could have lied, could have offered the hollow platitudes of a man reassuring a child, but she was not a child, and she had seen the same ledger he had. She knew the odds. "I do not know," he said, the truth rough and unvarnished. "The storm has to break by morning. If it breaks, we walk. If it does not." He left the sentence hanging, suspended in the warm air between them. Clara shifted, her hand moving in the darkness to rest over the bandage on his ribs, her palm cupping the source of his pain as if she could heal it by will alone. You came for us, she said, and there was a wonder in her tone that broke his heart. You did not have to. You could have stayed in your cabin and let the world burn. I tried, Elias murmured, closing his eyes, feeling the exhaustion dragging at him like a heavy tide. I tried to be a stone. I tried to bury myself with them. He was speaking of his wife and son, the ghosts that had haunted his silence for 3 years. But a stone does not bleed, Clara. And a stone does not feel the cold. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer, minimizing the space between them until they were breathing the same air. You woke me up. That gunshot, it did not just break the silence. It broke the ice. She moved her head, her forehead resting against his jaw. If we die, she whispered, her voice fierce and low, we die warm. We die together. And that is better than living alone in the cold. The words hung there, a defiant manifesto against the white oblivion outside. Elias felt a surge of emotion so powerful it made his throat ache. He turned his face into her hair, breathing in the scent of her, which lingered even through the sweat and fear, a scent of resilience, of life. He kissed her forehead, a gentle, lingering pressure in the dark. It was a vow. We are not going to die, he said, and this time, he made himself believe it. I am going to get you to Fort Bridger. I am going to put that ledger on a judge's desk. And then I am going to build you a house with windows that do not rattle in the wind. Is that a promise, Marshall? She asked, a ghost of a smile in her voice. That, Elias said, staring up into the blackness of the buffalo robe, listening to the wind scour the rock above them, is a fact. They lay there as the night dragged on, suspended in a timeless void of wind and stone. The children slept, their breathing soft and rhythmic, protected by the bodies of the adults. Elias fought sleep, terrified that if he drifted off, the fire in him would go out, but eventually, the warmth and the exhaustion claimed him. He slept with his hand tangled in Clara's hair and his other hand resting on the hilt of his knife, a man straddling the line between the violence of his past and the fragile hope of a future, while outside, the Wyoming winter raged, trying to bury them all in a tomb of white silence. But beneath the snow, beneath the robes, the heart of the resistance beat on, 4 pulses synced in the dark, waiting for the dawn. The dawn did not break so much as it bled into the sky, a pale, bruised purple that slowly surrendered to a blinding, relentless white. The storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving the Wyoming high country scoured clean and buried under 3 feet of fresh powder that glittered like diamond dust in the rising sun. Elias Thorne pushed the heavy buffalo robe aside, the frozen stiff hide cracking loudly in the stillness, and forced himself to stand. His legs felt like lengths of petrified wood, devoid of feeling from the knees down, and the movement sent a fresh, jagged bolt of agony tearing through the stitches in his side. He gritted his teeth, swallowing the groan that tried to escape, and looked out at the world. It was a landscape of deceptive beauty, pristine and deadly, but the air was still. The wind, that screaming banshee that had hunted them for 12 hours, had finally gone silent. He roused Clara and the children, their faces pale and waxen, eyes sunken with a fatigue that went beyond the bone. There was no food left, not even a crumb of hardtack, and their water skins were frozen solid blocks of ice. They ate snow to trick their bellies and began the walk. It was a trudge that belonged in the circles of hell reserved for the stubborn. Without the horses, every mile was a battle of will against physics. They broke trail and shifts, though Elias took the brunt of it, using his body as a plow to carve a path for the others. His wound burned with a feverish heat that terrified him more than the cold. Infection was a slower killer than hypothermia, but it was just as final. They walked for 6 hours, a silent procession of ghosts moving through a white void, until the geometry of the horizon changed. The jagged chaos of the pine forest gave way to the flat, wind-swept expanse of the parade ground, and there, rising from the snow like a promise made of timber and stone, was Fort Bridger. It was not a castle, it was a rough, ugly collection of barracks and stockades huddled against the wind, smelling of wood smoke, wet wool, and horse manure. To Elias, it smelled like salvation. They stumbled toward the gates, a ragtag group that looked more like beggars than witnesses to a high crime. Elias was a terrifying figure, his coat torn and blood stiffened, his beard matted with ice, his eyes burning with the manic intensity of a man running on nothing but adrenaline. The sentries on the wall leveled their rifles, shouting challenges that seemed to come from a great distance. Elias did not stop, he simply raised his hands, the oilskin-wrapped ledger clutched in his left fist like a weapon. "Federal Marshal," he croaked, his voice a ruined wreck. "I am a federal marshal. Open these gates." The authority in his tone, honed by 2 decades of carrying a badge, cut through his appearance. The heavy timber gates groaned open, revealing a muddy thoroughfare churned into a slurry of slush and filth by wagon wheels and hooves. They were met by a young lieutenant, a man named Holloway whose uniform was too clean and whose face was too smooth for this territory. He looked at Elias with a mixture of disgust and suspicion, his hand resting on the hilt of his saber. "State your business," Holloway demanded, flanked by 4 soldiers who looked bored and cold. Elias shoved the ledger toward him, not relinquishing his grip. "This is evidence of conspiracy, murder, and fraud involving the Union Pacific Railroad and Judge Wallace. I need to see the commanding officer, and I need a federal magistrate. Now." Holloway scoffed, looking at the ragged woman and the 2 shivering children clinging to her skirts. "You look like a deserter or a drunkard, mister. We do not have time for fairy tales. Hand over your weapons and we'll throw you in the stockade until we can verify who you are." "I am Elias Thorne," Elias snarled, stepping forward, causing the soldiers to tighten their grips on their rifles. "And if you put me in a cell, you are signing the death warrant for every homesteader in this valley. Read the book, Lieutenant. Read the damn names." The tension was a wire pulled to the breaking point, vibrating in the cold air. Clara stepped up beside him, her hand finding his arm, her presence a silent anchor. Holloway hesitated, his eyes flicking from the ledger to Elias's face. He was a bureaucrat in a uniform, a man who feared making a mistake more than he feared doing the wrong thing. Before the lieutenant could make a decision, the thunder of hooves erupted from the trail behind them. Elias spun around, his hand dropping to the Colt Peacemaker on his hip. A posse of 12 riders came tearing through the open gates, spraying mud and slush, their horses lathered and blowing hard. At the head of the column rode Harrington, the banker's enforcer, a man with a face like a hatchet and eyes like flint. He wore a long duster coat and carried a double-barreled shotgun across his saddle horn. Beside him rode James Wallace, looking pale but smug, clutching a rolled parchment in his gloved hand. The soldiers raised their rifles again, confused by the sudden invasion. "Hold your fire!" Harrington shouted, reining his horse in so hard the animal reared, its iron-shod hooves pawing the air just feet from Elias. "I am a deputized agent of the county court. These people are fugitives. I have a writ of seizure for their property and a warrant for the arrest of Elias Thorne for kidnapping and theft." Harrington's voice was a boom of thunder, designed to cow the weak and confuse the stupid. He waved the paper at Holloway. "Lieutenant, do your duty. Arrest this man, or stand aside and let us handle county business." Holloway looked at the official seal on the writ, then at the wild-eyed man with the ledger. The weight of legal paper was heavy in a soldier's mind. He took a step back, signaling his men to lower their weapons. "This is a civil matter," Holloway said, his voice wavering. "The army has no jurisdiction over county warrants." "You coward," Elias hissed, but he did not look at the lieutenant. His eyes were locked on Harrington. The enforcer smiled, a cold baring of teeth that held no humor. "End of the line, Thorne," Harrington said, leveling the shotgun. "Hand over the book. And maybe, just maybe, we let the widow and the brats walk away." It was a lie, and every soul in the muddy courtyard knew it. Men like Harrington did not leave witnesses, they cleaned house. Elias felt time slow down, the way it always did before the violence started. He could hear the heavy breathing of the horses, the creak of leather, the wind whistling through the stockade fence. He felt Clara stiffen beside him, saw her hand move slowly toward the pocket of her tattered coat where he knew she had hidden his spare revolver. He looked at her, just a flicker of a glance, and saw the steel in her spine. She was not going to run. She was going to fight. "The book stays with me," Elias said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that was far more terrifying than a shout. "And you are not walking out of this fort, Harrington. You are going to hang." Harrington's smile vanished. "Kill them all," he ordered, racking the hammers of his shotgun. The world exploded. Elias moved before the last word was out of Harrington's mouth. He did not draw, the Colt was already clearing leather as he dropped to one knee, making himself a smaller target. He fired, the heavy boom of the .45 rolling across the parade ground. The bullet caught Harrington in the chest, punching through the duster and knocking him backward off his saddle. The shotgun discharged into the sky, blowing a hole in the morning silence. Chaos erupted. The posse opened fire, the air filling with the zip and whine of lead. Elias threw himself sideways, tackling Clara and the children, driving them into the mud behind the heavy oak water trough just as the wood splintered under a hail of bullets. "Stay down!" Elias roared, rolling onto his back and firing blindly over the rim of the trough. He worked the hammer of the peacemaker with a rhythm born of desperate practice, bang, click-clack, bang, click-clack. 2 of the riders went down, their horses screaming and bolting, adding to the pandemonium. The soldiers were shouting, scrambling for cover, their discipline shattering under the crossfire. Holloway was screaming orders that no one could hear. Elias popped up to fire again, but a rider was flanking them, a man with a scar across his nose raising a Winchester. Elias swung his aim, but his hammer clicked on an empty chamber. He froze, the realization of death arriving with the clarity of a bell. But the shot did not come from the rider. It came from beside him. A deafening roar, close and sharp. The rider's head snapped back, and he tumbled from his horse. Elias looked down. Clara was on her knees in the slush, holding the spare Navy revolver with both hands, smoke curling from the barrel. Her eyes were wide, tears streaming down her dirty face, but her hands were steady. She did not look at the dead man, she looked at Elias, terrified and fierce. She jacked the hammer back for another shot. "Reload," she screamed at him, the sound tearing her throat. Elias fumbled for cartridges, his fingers slick with mud and blood. The posse was regrouping, dismounting to use their horses as cover. James Wallace was screaming hysterically, shooting his pistol wildly in their direction. Bullets chewed up the mud around them, splashing freezing slush into their eyes. Elias snapped the loading gate shut and rose to a crouch. He took a breath, centering himself in the chaos. He was not a rancher. He was not a hermit. He was a marshal, and this was his court. He stood up, exposing himself to the fire. He shot the man nearest Wallace, dropping him. He shot the man trying to rush the trough with a knife. He moved with a fluidity that belied his wound, a dance of violence that was terrible to behold. But there were too many of them. A bullet caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him around, the impact feeling like a sledgehammer blow. He went down hard, the world graying out at the edges. He tried to rise, but his limbs would not obey. He saw a shadow loom over him, one of Harrington's men, grinning, raising a pistol for the execution shot. Then came a roar of musketry that shook the ground. Lieutenant Holloway, shamed by the woman's courage or perhaps finally remembering his oath, had rallied his men. A volley of rifle fire from the barracks porch swept the courtyard. The man standing over Elias jerked and collapsed. The remaining members of the posse threw down their weapons, raising their hands as the blue-coated soldiers swarmed them, bayonets fixed. Silence returned to the fort, heavier than before, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the sobbing of the children. Elias lay in the mud, the cold seeping into his back, staring up at the white sky. His shoulder was a mask of fire, his side a dull throb, but he was breathing. A face appeared above him. Clara. She was weeping openly now, her hands fluttering over his chest, checking his wounds. She looked like an angel that had been dragged through hell, and Elias thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "You idiot," she sobbed, pressing her scarf against his bleeding shoulder. "You absolute, stubborn idiot." We got, Elias wheezed, a bloody grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Did you see the lieutenant?" "Hush," she commanded, wiping mud from his forehead. "Save your breath." Holloway walked over, his face pale, his saber drawn but lowered. He looked at the carnage in his courtyard, 6 dead men, others wounded, the snow turned to a slurry of crimson mud. He looked at the ledger, which lay in the muck where Elias had dropped it. He bent down and picked it up, wiping the filth from the cover. He opened it, his eyes scanning the pages, reading the names, the payments, the cold arithmetic of murder. He looked at James Wallace, who was being dragged away in irons, screaming about his father's influence. Then he looked down at Elias. "Get the surgeon," Holloway ordered his men, his voice steady for the first time. "And send a telegram to the governor. Tell him we have the evidence. Tell him Marshal Thorne has cleaned house." Elias closed his eyes, the darkness pulling at him, but it was not the cold, empty darkness of the grave. It was a warm, heavy sleep. He felt Clara's hand gripping his uninjured one, holding on tight. He squeezed back, weak but present. The war was over. The gavel had fallen, ringing out in the sound of a Colt. 45, and the verdict was final. They carried him into the infirmary, Clara walking beside the stretcher, refusing to let go of his hand even as they passed through the doors. The smell of ether and iodine replaced the smell of gunpowder. Elias drifted, his mind unmooring from the pain. He thought of the ranch. He thought of the quiet of the pines. But mostly, he thought of the woman with the gun in her hand and the fire in her eyes, and he knew, with a certainty that went deeper than bone, that he would never be cold again. The solitude he had cherished was dead, buried in the mud of Fort Bridger, and in its place was something terrifying, messy, and loud. Something that felt, for the first time in 3 years, like a life worth living. The spring thaw arrived in the high country not with a whisper, but with the roar of liberated water, the creeks swelling with the blood of the winter snow until they tore through the valleys like liquid silver. It was May of 1891, 3 months since the guns had fallen silent at Fort Bridger, and the Wyoming Territory had transformed from a white tomb into a riot of violent, desperate green. The cottonwoods along the river bottoms were budding with a fuzzy, pale hope, and the air smelled of wet loam, pine resin, and the sweet, heavy scent of damp sage. Elias Thorne stood on the porch of his cabin, a hammer in his hand and a mouthful of nails, looking out at a world he barely recognized, not because the land had changed, but because he had. The cabin, once a dark hole where a man went to wait for death, was alive. The roof had been patched with fresh cedar shakes that shone red in the sun. The fence line, broken and sagging for years, stood straight and tight, holding back the 2 milk cows he had traded for in town. But the biggest change was the sound. The silence of the axe was gone, replaced by the laughter of children chasing a scruffy dog through the tall grass and the rhythmic thumping of Clara Vance beating a rug over the railing. Elias spat the nails into his palm and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. His shoulder still ached when the pressure dropped, a deep, grinding reminder of the bullet that had nearly taken his arm, and his side was a map of puckered scar tissue that pulled tight when he stretched, but the pain was different now. It was no longer the pointless suffering of a man punishing himself, it was the honest ache of living. He watched Clara pause in her work, her hair escaping her bonnet in wisps that caught the sunlight. She looked up, feeling his gaze, and smiled, a genuine, easy expression that softened the hard lines around her eyes. They had not married, not yet, for the circuit preacher had not made his rounds since the thaw, but in every way that mattered, they were bound. They shared the work, the table, and the bed, finding in the dark of the night a comfort that banished the ghosts of the past. The ledger, that heavy book of death, had been handed over to the authorities, and the silence from the capital they took as a sign that justice was grinding its slow gears. Elias allowed himself to believe, for the first time in 4 years, that the war was over. He was building a porch swing. He was thinking about planting corn. He was a fool. The riders appeared on the eastern rise an hour before noon, silhouetted against the blinding blue of the sky. There were only 2 of them, moving at a steady, bureaucratic trot that lacked the urgency of a posse but carried the weight of official business. Elias felt the old instinct prickle at the base of his neck, the lizard brain warning that had kept him alive through the Indian Wars and the Marshal's service. He set the hammer down slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers, and stepped off the porch. Clara stopped beating the rug. She moved to the edge of the railing, her hand instinctively going to her apron pocket, though she carried no weapon there today. She called the children, her voice sharp and clear, and they came running, sensing the shift in the air, the sudden tension that turned the sunlight cold. Elias walked to the gate, his gait uneven, favoring his left leg, and waited. The men rode up to the fence and reined in. They were not gun hands, and that frightened Elias more than a dozen Winchesters would have. The man on the left wore a suit of grey wool that was too heavy for the season and a bowler hat that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of the Tetons. He had a face like a ledger book, pale, lined, and utterly devoid of humor. The man on the right was younger, wearing the badge of AU.S. Deputy Marshal, but he held his reins with the awkward stiffness of a city man. The grey-suited man adjusted his spectacles and looked down at Elias with the dispassionate appraisal of a butcher eyeing a side of beef. "Elias Thorne?" the man asked, his voice dry as dust. "I am," Elias said, keeping his hands visible, hanging loose at his sides. "And this is private property. State your business." The man dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft mud of the drive. He pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebag, unbuckling it with maddening slowness. "I am Cyrus Vickers, federal magistrate for the District of Wyoming. This is Deputy Marshal Karras. We are here regarding the incident at Fort Bridger on the 14th of February, and the matter of the Union Pacific right-of-way." Elias felt a stone drop in his gut. "The incident," he repeated, the words tasting like ash. "You mean the day I stopped a corrupt banker and his hired killers from murdering a woman and 2 children? You mean the day I handed over proof of conspiracy and murder to the United States Army?" Vickers sighed, a sound of profound weariness, as if he were explaining simple arithmetic to a slow child. He pulled a sheaf of papers from the portfolio. "We have reviewed the ledger, Mr. Thorne. It is colorful. But it is inadmissible. It was obtained through burglary and theft. Furthermore, the men you killed, Mr. Harrington and his associates, were duly sworn deputies of the county court, executing a legal writ of seizure. In the eyes of the law, what happened at Fort Bridger was not justice. It was a massacre of law enforcement officers by a vigilante." "That is a lie," Clara shouted, rushing down the steps, heedless of Elias's hand raised to stop her. She stopped at the gate, gripping the wood until her knuckles were white. "They were murderers. They killed my husband. They tried to kill us. Lieutenant Holloway saw it. He fought beside us." "Lieutenant Holloway," Vickers said, not even looking at her, "has been reassigned to a post in the Arizona Territory. His report was confused. The official inquiry has determined that he acted under duress and misinformation provided by Mr. Thorne." Vickers adjusted his glasses and looked back at Elias. "I have here a warrant for your arrest, Mr. Thorne. The charges are 3 counts of murder in the first degree, resisting arrest, and assaulting a federal officer. You are to be transported to Cheyenne for trial." Elias stared at the man, the world tilting on its axis. The sun was still shining, the creek was still rushing, but the reality of the scene was a nightmare. They had sanitized it. They had taken the blood and the terror and the truth and washed it away with ink. The railroad did not just buy judges, it bought the narrative. It bought history. And the land? Elias asked, his voice low, a growl vibrating in his chest. What about the land? Vickers pulled a second document from the portfolio. It was stamped with the heavy, red seal of the Department of the Interior. This is an order of eminent domain, signed by the Secretary of the Interior and ratified by the territorial governor. The route for the Union Pacific Spur has been finalized. The federal government has determined that this valley is essential for the completion of the line, which is a matter of national security and economic necessity. He gestured to the surveyor who had remained on his horse, a quiet man who was already unstrapping a brass theodolite from his pack. The Vance homestead and the Thorn Ranch are hereby condemned. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. Compensation has been set at $2 an acre, which will be held in escrow pending the outcome of your trial. $2 an acre. It was an insult. It was theft wrapped in a flag. Elias looked at the deputy, who had drawn his revolver, not pointing it, but holding it ready. He looked at Clara. Her face was stricken, all the color drained away, leaving her looking like the ghost he had found in the snow months ago. She reached for the gate latch, her eyes wild. No, she whispered. No, we will not let you. Elias, get the rifle. Elias looked at her, then at the children huddled on the porch, watching with wide, terrified eyes. He looked at the deputy's gun. If he moved, if he fought, he could kill these two men. He knew that with the certainty of gravity. He could draw his Colt and drop them both before they cleared their holsters. And then what? More would come. A regiment. A trainload of soldiers. They would burn the cabin. They would kill Clara. They would orphan the children. The war was not against men anymore, it was against the machine, against the inevitable, grinding march of a future that had no place for men like him. Clara, Elias said, his voice cracking. Do not. Fight them, she screamed, tears spilling down her cheeks. You promised. You promised we would build a home. I promised you would live, Elias said softly. He stepped away from the gate, moving slowly toward the magistrate. He unbuckled his gun belt, the heavy leather falling into the mud with a wet slap. He raised his hands. I surrender. Elias, no. Clara threw open the gate, grabbing his arm, pulling at him. Do not you dare. Do not you dare leave us. Elias turned to her, ignoring the deputy who was stepping forward with iron shackles. He took her face in his rough hands, memorizing the lines of it, the heat of her skin, the fierce, beautiful life in her eyes. Listen to me, he said, staring into her soul. Take the money. Take the children. Go to Oregon. Go somewhere the tracks do not go. But you live, Clara. You survive. That is how we beat them. We survive. I do not want to survive without you, she sobbed, clinging to his coat. You have to, he whispered. He kissed her, a hard, desperate press of lips that tasted of salt and the end of the world, and then he pulled away. He held his hands out to the deputy. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut, locking his wrists together, binding the hands that had chopped wood, fired rifles, and held a woman in the dark. Vickers nodded, satisfied. A wise choice, Mr. Thorne. He turned to the surveyor. Mark it, Karas. Center line runs right through the cabin. The surveyor dismounted and walked past Clara, who stood frozen in the mud, her hand reaching out toward Elias. The man carried a long wooden stake painted bright red and a heavy mallet. He walked into the yard, trampling the small patch of turned earth where Clara had planted her vegetable garden. He stopped in the center of the green shoots, right where the peas were just beginning to curl toward the sun. He set the point of the stake into the soft, wet earth. He swung the mallet. Thwack. The sound was loud in the quiet afternoon. It sounded like a gavel. It sounded like a gunshot. Elias was hoisted onto the back of the deputy's spare horse, his legs tied beneath the belly. He did not look back at the cabin. He could not bear to see the surveyor driving the stake into the heart of the life he had tried to build. He kept his eyes fixed on the western horizon, where the mountains rose jagged and white, indifferent to the suffering of men. As they rode out, leaving the weeping woman and the silent children standing in the ruin of their hope, a sound drifted on the wind from miles away. It was a high, lonesome shriek, echoing off the canyon walls. It was the whistle of the steam engine, the iron horse, calling out its victory over the wild, drowning out the sobs of the widow and the silence of the marshal. The train was coming, and it stopped for no man.